absolutely everyone, including me, thought I was running towards my dream. But as I look back on it now, I'm pretty sure I was running from myself. Back up, buddy, back up, back up. You know, for years I had been dreaming about and making plans about starting up a farm. And after making all of those preparations and doing all of those things to get ready, I finally was making the leap. You know, I actually recall really distinctly this conversation I had at the farewell party that my work in Washington, D.C. was throwing for me as I was moving to Vermont, and talking to a coworker, and they were like, wow, man, you're gonna be living the dream. You're gonna be so happy. And I remember hearing that and feeling like, yeah, I think that's gonna be the case. But deep down, I knew that that wasn't gonna be exactly true. You know, here I was ditching the city life for the farm life, and I was expecting everything to be just perfect. You know, like there's this picture perfect view of what farm life's supposed to be like, and it's all idyllic, and you know, you're out eating fresh eggs, and you got a dog, and you're moving your cattle and doing all that stuff. And I will admit that a lot of farm life is like that, but I also think it would be a little bit disingenuous to not also acknowledge that there's a lot of challenges, failures, hardships, and just things that suck when it comes to farm life too. So for you guys that don't know me, my name is Morgan Gold. I am a farmer, but not by birth or training. I grew up in the suburbs of Connecticut. I went to an art school in Boston for college, and I ultimately ended up stumbling my way working into like corporate marketing, insurance, and investment companies. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I found myself really, really unhappy with life and really unhappy with where I was. Even though I had found financial success, I was also feeling like I was working a career that was really unsatisfying, really unrewarding, and like all of the different talents I had and like different parts of me as a person, I wasn't really utilizing. I was cramming them down into a place deep in my gut, and I was just doing the things that I thought I was supposed to do to be successful at my job. And just in case if anybody is wondering, doing something like that is a perfect way to find yourself very, very unhappy and facing a midlife crisis. You know, I didn't try to satisfy that midlife crisis with, say, buying a sports car or other stupid, destructive things that people who have midlife crises can do. But despite the fact that I was facing that midlife crisis, I was also becoming absolutely fascinated with the path of organic and regenerative farming practices and things like permaculture. And so those two things of feeling very unhappy with my career as well as finding this new thing I was passionate about led me and my wife to ultimately move from Washington, D.C. to here in northern Vermont, where we purchased this abandoned 160-acre dairy farm, or former dairy farm I should say, and we started rehabbing the house, and we made plans to move up here. And my wife moved up here in 2017, and by spring of 2018 I was able to move up here. And so as I look at what my life ultimately looks like now, I don't know, it's starting to feel kind of like what I had dreamed about when I was so unhappy in Washington, D.C. and I was running away from something. But those first couple of years, as I look back on it now, you know, while I was definitely having this passion and fire reignited in myself by everything that we started to build here on the farm, I was also painfully ignoring that I had a lot of problems and flaws, and I wasn't getting comfortable with working on those. And that right there, my friends, is oftentimes what they call the rub. Like, I'll rub my baby bull's butt here. You often think that if you chase your dream and you pursue your dream and then you get on the path for finding your dream, that is going to be the thing that makes you happy. But let me just tell you right now, folks, that is most definitely not the case. Because the truth of the matter is, despite what you think your life's going to be like, and it might be very drastically different, you're still going to be you with all of your flaws and with all of your weaknesses. And a change of scenery and a change of setting and even a change of career is not going to change any of that. And probably most importantly, it's not going to make you happy. You know, the other week I was actually on this podcast with some friends. It's called You Are Good. It's hosted by Sarah Marshall and Alex Steed, and it's this podcast about movies and emotions, or viewing movies through emotions and feelings and how they make you feel and all that sort of stuff, and relationships and kind of dealing with your crap and all that good stuff. And we had this really great conversation about the movie City Slickers. And now City Slickers has been a movie that's always been very, very important to me for I don't even know why. It's a 1991 film starring Billy Crystal and Bruno Kirby and Daniel Stern as three friends who go on like a dude ranch style cattle drive. Jack Palance actually won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his role as Curly, the trail boss guy. And this was a movie that I remember watching with like my parents and my sister, like on a kind of family movie night where we picked up a rental movie from the local video store. And at the time, I remember like the movie came out and Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays Billy Crystal's son, was actually like the same age that I was. And I remember watching it and thinking, it's interesting, it's kind of funny. Billy Crystal has some funny one-liners, it's great, yada, yada, yada. And you know, over the years, it's one of those movies that would pop up and be like ubiquitous on a TNT or TBS or USA or like one of those cable, it was like a cable movie that you would just be flipping channels and be like, oh, City Slickers is on, let's watch part of it, okay. My mom, for some reason, always clung to that scene where Billy Crystal's mom would call him to wish him a happy birthday in the morning, and so anytime she calls me to wish me a happy birthday, she kind of does that whole routine. But that movie never really held much like personal significance for me until I watched it again one time when I was in my mid-30s, and I was at that point of like deep depression, living in Washington, DC, with the career I wasn't happy about, really starting to wonder what it was all about. And I watched it again, and at that point I identified so much with Billy Crystal's character. I felt like such a kinship and felt like, oh my gosh, that's like me. And I should probably also acknowledge the grim reality that first watching the movie, I was Jake Gyllenhaal's age. Now watching it on the second time around, I was closer to Billy Crystal's age and nearing 40. And now as I'm recording this video, I am older than Billy Crystal's character, which is a really unsettling feeling just in and of itself. And you know, in the movie, Billy Crystal feels like his job's meaningless. You know, he even says at one point that he just sells air. And that to me is not insignificant because that's exactly how I was feeling. And so Billy Crystal's wife encourages him to go off on this adventure with his best friends. They always go on these wild, crazy trips. And they go on this dude ranch. And I'm not gonna do a whole synopsis of the movie, but the reality is he has this conversation with Curly, the trail boss, about like the meaning of life and what's important. And Curly always says it's this one thing. At first, Billy Crystal's kind of like confused by it. He's like, well, what is that one thing? And you know, Jack Palance is like, well, that's what you got to figure out. And so without totally spoiling the movie for you, I'll say that by the end of the film, Billy Crystal figures out what his one thing is, and he ends up finding happiness going back with his wife and his family. And so while I was on this wonderful podcast having just a very fun and enjoyable conversation about city slickers, depression, the 90s, like a whole bunch of stuff like that, I was asked a question about the idea of, does like say moving to the farm make you happy, and does that actually become your one thing? You know, the reality is, no matter where you go and what you do, you are still going to be you. And you've got to get comfortable with that fact or you will never, ever, ever be happy. And I think that that's a point that a lot of people don't like to talk about when it comes to folks who make videos like the videos I make. Like, yes, changing your setting and living in a beautiful place like the beautiful place we live in here and following your dreams, like those things will most certainly help and make it easier to be happy. And just know that changing your external isn't going to necessarily change your internal. And until you're willing to put the investment in to work on your internal, I don't know, I think you're gonna be fundamentally on the same hamster wheel of running from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. But as an emphasis to that, as well as a response directly to a few folks who have written me emails on this topic, and yes, I do wanna thank folks who responded to the video where I talked about my weight loss a bit and my eating disorder, you know, all of those positive comments that you guys gave me, it was so nice. And so I do want to say thank you to that. In that process of working on yourself, believe me, it's not easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of, I don't know, soul searching and hard issues, and I don't know, it's something I'm still going through, and I don't even have great advice on how to do it. Heck, if anybody does, please by all means share. But what I will say is that that investment in yourself will make a massive difference in how you feel regardless of what your setting actually is. You know, it's funny, the spot where I have my bull and my steer right now that I've just moved them to is actually a very significant one here on our farm, and that it has a significant memory for me. In that the day that I actually purchased the farm, like the actual day that I signed the paperwork and closed on this place, I decided to take a drive around the pasture. And this was, I don't know, I guess mid-July. And so the grass was probably even taller than it is right now. And I was driving right along this farm road right here. And I had this like cheap rental car SUV that I was driving at the time. And like pretty much right there at that spot that Randy's walking towards right now, I heard a scraping and a clunk. And I was just like, oh crap. And I hopped out of the rental car, looked around, and it turned out what I had driven into was this big old wreckage of a greenhouse that used to be up here, maybe a hoop house technically, that used to be up here on the top of the pasture. You know, this farm, it used to be a dairy way back in the day, but there really haven't been cattle on this land since I guess the early 90s. The people who owned it in the 2000s, they actually ran like an organic vegetable farm, and so they did a lot of growing up here on this top pasture because the soil is absolutely wonderful. But after the farm closed down, a lot of the stuff kind of went into decay, and when I discovered that wreckage of the greenhouse, I discovered a brand new problem on this farm that was lurking underneath the surface that I wasn't even aware of. And I mean, it was actually pretty funny because like I panicked and I spent probably about 2 hours trying to untangle the rebar and wire that had wrapped itself around the axle of this rental car. Believe me, it was a perfect disaster for my first day here on the farm. And so it was that moment that I realized that there were a lot of underlying problems with this farm that I was going to need to reckon with and deal with. And you know, actually a couple months later, I think that fall, I had some friends up and we were staying at the farm and hanging out, and we made our project to be to like clean up a lot of the pasture and clean up the farm. And honestly, probably the first whole year that I owned this property, that's where most of my time went when I would come up here and stay. It was either that or we were doing like a lot of renovations and work on our house. And I tell you this story because I feel like it's a good metaphor for the issue I'm talking to you about today, in that you really can't focus on doing the work of building things and doing all the great things you want to chase unless you're willing to grapple with and deal with the things that are lying underneath the surface. And that's something that I have found in making that transition from city life to farm life. That's just something I've found as I've tried to find happiness for myself in my life. And so that's just also a little thought that I wanted to pass on to you guys. So hopefully you find that useful. Now, in case you guys are wondering what's going on with my bull and my steer, well, they've been getting very cranky and restless over the last couple of weeks, and they have run out of grass to eat around the house, and so I decided to move them up here on this far side of the pasture. So like this side over here, which is actually the northern side of our pasture, I just gave them like one big paddock that I'm gonna leave them in for, I don't know, a couple more weeks. I'm waiting before I mix my bull in with the ladies. You know, even though he's a little guy, he could probably still get the job done once he figures it out. And so if I put them in right now, that means I'm still getting babies in March, and our Marches are so volatile. I might even wait a little bit longer, and he might not get out to the girls until some point in July. But until then, I wanted Macho Man Randy Savage as well as Joey Ramone to get a chance to just chew on some grass and also help me keep up with the pasture, because the grass, as you see, is just growing so crazy at this point. I do have a little bit of risk in this, in that, you know, outside of this electric fence, there's another electric fence all the way on the other side of the pasture, which has my cows. If one of those ladies went into heat, he could potentially jump the fence, and that could cause a problem. But it's a calculated risk that I feel like I'm taking, because number one, it's dependent on their heat cycles. Number two, it's dependent on him escaping, which he's actually been really good about not escaping whenever I've grazed him with electric wire so far. And then number three, who knows? I mean, if I'm having a late March baby, it's not gonna kill me. But that said, I felt like it was the right time to get him out. This also gives me the opportunity to clean out the winter cattle yard and reset things and get it right for what we're going to be doing next winter. And then Joey Ramone just basically goes wherever Randy goes, because I don't like to let Randy Savage be alone. Like, cattle are herd animals, and so they want to be with other animals like themselves. And so it'll actually be really interesting to see when he's reunited with his mom, I guess, in a couple of weeks. I don't plan on moving them every single day, but I'll leave them here for a week or so before moving them to another spot. Yes, Joey Ramone is starting to let me brush him too, so that's a good sign. Ooh, easy, buddy, easy. I'm sorry. I might just have to cut that dreadlock off.